Okay, so let's move on to our next session, please. This session is API security and ecosystem trust, protecting the keys to your kingdom. And we are going to welcome Jeremy Snyder. Jeremy, hi, how are you? Nice to meet you.
I'm
And
likewise, Mariana. I'm doing well. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. So, if you agree, why don't we start with you giving a little bit of an introduction of yourself, and then you proceed with your presentation.
Yeah, happy to. So I'm Jeremy.
Okay.
I'm one of the two co-founders at FireTail. FireTail is about a year and a half old company working in the API security space. My co-founder and I actually came to API security out of cloud security, and we witnessed firsthand kind of the evolution of architecture down this microservice path that Kanchana just got done talking about. So we actually started FireTail in response to some of the challenges that we saw organizations facing rather as they made that transition. And so, yeah, happy to be here and share some of what we've learned on our journey and talk a little bit about how API security becomes a key pillar of digital ecosystem trust and how you should maybe think about it as you're undertaking your own efforts in digital transformation and in further cloud adoption. So the title of today's presentation, API Security and Ecosystem Trust, Protecting the Keys to Your Kingdom. And I will say, to some extent, I'm not talking about digital keys like API tokens and so on. But on the other hand, we are also talking about that. And we've got a lot to get through in the next kind of 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to go a little bit quickly. I hope you can keep up with me. And I want to try to leave some time for Q&A at the end. Feel free to just drop your comments into the chat or your questions into the chat, and we'll try to make sure we have some time for that at the end. So like I said, API security and ecosystem trust, protecting the keys to your kingdom, but also how to lose trust. And I think that's something that a lot of people are afraid of, and probably you have some ideas in your head about the obvious ways that you can lose trust, but we want to talk about a few of the non-obvious ways and then talk about ways to make sure that you don't lose trust. So like I said, I'm one of the two co-founders over here at FireTail. We are a venture-backed startup headquartered in the Washington, D.C. area, but also with offices in Ireland and Finland. My co-founder and I came out of the cloud world. I spent some time at AWS, DivvyCloud, Rapid7, and a number of others along the way. I've attended schools in 4 countries around the world and speak a few different languages. It's been a global journey for all of us in the team. And we've actually got, I think, 7 or 8 nationalities in a team of just 13. So a very diverse group, and we are still hiring. So do check us out on our website for a couple of job postings that we have open. Last thing, please do see my contact details on the screen, jeremy@firetail.io. I have a Twitter handle there, but please do not tweet at me. I almost never go on Twitter. I'll maybe get a notification if you send me a direct message, but chances are I'll probably miss it. So if you do want to reach out for any questions or you want the slides after the presentation, please just hit me up on email, and we'll also post the slides on our company blog in about a week's time after today's event. So first thing I want to talk about, I think we've all had a lot of exposure to APIs by this point, and we know kind of functionally what an API does. And an API is a way for 2 pieces of software, 2 systems to kind of talk to each other, and one system to kind of request data from the other, or one system to request the other to process a piece of a business function or a business transaction for it. But how are APIs an ecosystem construct? An example I like to use for this is actually one that I think a lot of people will be familiar with, and that's kind of mobile food delivery. So when you think about ordering food via a mobile app, probably you might have already realized that not that much is actually happening on your mobile device. So not much happening on your phone. Of course, there's an initial kind of startup where your phone gets your GPS coordinates, sends that to a cloud server, and that cloud server then, based on your location, will send back a list of restaurants that are available for you to order from. With that list will also come menus and pricing and all of that kind of stuff. You'll go through that list, you'll choose your items, and then you submit your order. Well, we've already had 3 API calls or 3 API transactions in just that kind of startup phase, right? Where we sent our GPS coordinates, we received back some info, and we now submit our order. When we submit the order as one package, but what happens to that one package afterwards is that it actually goes out to multiple parties for the completion of that order. So we'll order through some app like DoorDash or Just Eat or Deliveroo, Delivery Hero, depending where you are in the world, Foodora, Pandora, whatever, Food Panda. What will happen from that point onwards is they will kind of take charge of that, but then they will farm out certain aspects of that order to other third parties, right? So to a delivery service, to the restaurant itself, to a payment provider. And again, we've got multiple API calls kind of going back and forth, or we've got API calls and confirmations coming back, but a lot of API enabled traffic happening just to support that one transaction. Recently, I sat down with somebody who works at one of these food delivery companies on the security side, and we started to go through just how many API calls get executed both internally and externally in order to facilitate what to me as a user is a single transaction. And we started counting and we got up to about 25 and we said, okay, that's enough. There's probably some more. But just think about that for a second. We've got 4 parties involved minimally, or 5 if you include me as a consumer. And we've got all these different pieces of business transaction that are getting executed by the different third parties, right? Payment processing, food preparation, delivery, order coordination, and so on. And we've also got a lot of sensitive data and sensitive business transactions. So again, sending my payment credentials to a third party that then processes them and so on, plus the PII around my name and my preferences, my delivery address, my phone number, all of that kind of stuff will get into this whole transaction. And I think that kind of shows you what the ecosystem is like, right? So for just one thing, we've got 5 parties, sensitive data, sensitive business transactions. And so the point of this is kind of how the modern internet works. No one company is really going to take the time to construct all of those different business logic or business capabilities. Why? Because you don't need to. You can tap into third parties who offer these services via APIs in order to facilitate it. And I think for a lot of companies, the Amazon flywheel is really the desired effect. And if you're not familiar with this, I would encourage you to kind of just Google the Amazon flywheel and you'll find any number of articles that analyze the brilliance of it. And the point is that you start with a set of core capabilities. And with those core capabilities, you attract an audience. And that audience brings, their spending dollars, their eyeballs, et cetera. And then you think about how can you expand on that? And if you think about the growth of Amazon as a company over the last 30 years or whatever it's been at this point, it started with book sales and that attracted an audience. And then on top of that audience, they started to expand into other categories of products that they could offer via the same e-commerce engine. And then that marketplace grew and attracted other sellers. Those sellers bring in a lower cost structure because of unit economics across things like delivery and operations. Those unit economic reductions bring in lower prices, which brings a better customer experience. And you get this kind of virtuous cycle of this flywheel effect where everybody who comes in offers more value to the entire ecosystem. And if we think for a second again about that previous example of food delivery, just think about new restaurants kind of joining that network, more delivery drivers expanding the delivery area that's offered in a particular market, more customers bringing in better unit economics to lower prices across the board. And this is kind of the virtuous cycle again, or the flywheel effect that you can get, where the entire ecosystem gets better as a result of opening up. And that is fundamentally what APIs allow us to do in the modern internet, or in the modern kind of app economy that we live in. So we probably already realize that this is happening, but I don't know that everybody really understands quite the scale or the impact that it's already having on the web as we know it. More than 80% of internet requests today are API calls to do exactly the types of things that we've talked about, power these kind of multi-third party interactions that enable a business transaction. And we're into the billions of APIs across the web already. I think we're in the tens of billions. But with the pace of acceleration that we have, we are on track towards having 1 trillion APIs across the web in the next kind of 7-year time. So here we are in June of 2023 as I'm giving this presentation. And I think, 6.5 years from now, we will very much see 1 trillion APIs across the web. So what does this mean? It means that as you kind of put your own services and your own offerings out there, you need to become a trusted business partner for others to interact with. And so when we think about ecosystem trust, I found a nice study on the 4 core pillars of digital ecosystem trust and why digital trust is so essential for the future of the internet. Hopefully, what we've gone over today already kind of establishes why this is the future of the internet and how all the trends align to show that this kind of API enabled business and API enabled communication and transactions is already the direction that we're moving in. But let's talk about those 4 core pillars for a second, and then we're going to go into some examples around violating that trust and how we can think about preventing those violations. So, number one is, of course, security. Nobody wants to be the partner that accidentally has a data breach or has a data leak or exposure. Why? Because your partners will lose confidence in you and may remove you from that ecosystem. Second, privacy very much goes hand in hand with security. When we think back again to that example that I gave of the mobile food delivery, the privacy element in there is very strong. How will I, as a consumer, feel if my privacy is breached and my PII is again exposed or let's say mishandled, even if it's not a public exposure, if it's mishandled between partners in that ecosystem? Certainly, the most famous example there would be something like Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, where the privacy of the consumers, even though the data wasn't necessarily exposed broadly, but the privacy, the way that data was handled, very much was a violation of what consumers expected from the Facebook platform. And the third is, of course, reliability. If I'm the payment processor in that mobile food delivery order and I don't have a reliable service that is there, is up, available, performs, etc., that's going to really cause people to move away from me. And guess what? There's any number of other third parties out there competing to be part of ecosystems that are being built. So reliability is also a very, very core pillar, a very core feature that we need to think about. And then last but not least is transparency. And that's transparency both to your partners and to the consumers who might be leveraging your services, whether directly or indirectly. And that transparency really comes down to actually the 3 things that are the first 3 pillars. So if you don't have transparency around your security practices or around your privacy and data handling and around reliability, it's going to make it very difficult for other organizations to kind of put their trust in you and incorporate you into their ecosystem. And that really translates in a few different ways. So when we think about best practices in the transparency side, of course, it's things like good end user license agreements, good terms of service, good privacy policies, good security and audit certification. So things like a SOC 2 or an ISO 27001, or maybe industry specific on some other aspects. But having that visibility available for your partners to understand, to look at, to examine in whatever level of detail is right for them is going to be a key consideration as they look at incorporating you again into that ecosystem that they're building. So the fastest way to destroying your API ecosystem is, of course, to lose trust. And so you can think about any of those 4 core pillars and the things that you can do. So I want to take a few minutes to examine some recent examples of areas where trust has been violated, specifically relative to APIs, and then talk about things that we can do or think about doing as strategies to make sure that this doesn't happen to us. So as we speak here in June of 2023, we're kind of still in the midst of this Reddit ecosystem change regarding the API usage that they have. Reddit's had an API for a long time that's been available free of charge, and they recently decided to start charging for it. Well, we've all seen now kind of the public community protests against that, making their data go dark, so to speak, so that Reddit is no longer indexable in many subreddits, which are actually the key driver of traffic. Those subreddits and the content contributed by the community is what boosts Reddit up the Google search engine rankings and brings in so much traffic. And so that kind of lack of predictability and lack of transparency, I think, is the number one driver of what really has pushed the community away, or let's say the lack of reliability on continuing a service in the way that the community expected. Peloton a couple of years ago had a responsible disclosure from a security researcher who found a vulnerability in their API. They were given the standard kind of 60 to 90-day response period. They took no response. And then as a proof of concept, 3 million records were extracted off of their IoT backend. And we saw a couple different things around what happened in terms of security misconfiguration or API vulnerability. I won't go into depth here, but you can find some of my other talks where I've examined this and explained it in detail from, let's say, APIdays New York earlier this year. And what you really saw was a dramatic effect on Peloton at the time. Their stock price decreased or declined like pretty rapidly. And there was a lot of fallout after this event. I think there were some senior executives who ended up leaving the organization. Why? It's an extreme violation of consumer trust. And last but not least, also in the last couple of weeks here, Schneider Electric recently disclosed a breach relative to its APIs, again for an IoT backend with weak credentials. A single set of credentials that was shared across a whole fleet of IoT devices. And those credentials were in a weak configuration stored as clear text. So this is actually an example of where API keys have been breached or have been exposed inadvertently. And, we're still kind of witnessing the fallout of what's going on there, but I don't predict that it's going to be a very great outcome for anybody involved. So these are some examples. So when we think about how we can look at, doing better, well, certainly let's maintain those 4 core pillars of trust. And I think prioritizing security, privacy as part of that is something that not a lot of organizations are doing. A lot of organizations that we talk to have strong security programs relative to things like network security, infrastructure security, maybe identity and application security, but not so much on the API side. I think API security, as we talk today, is very much an emerging field and something that we at FireTail are hoping to work with a lot of organizations on and already beginning to work with them on. But there's a couple other things around this that you'll see from some of these examples. Number one is communication. So when we think about APIs often have versions, they have certain features associated with them. Those might be commercial features like the transition from free to paid, or they might be technical features like the version of the API. So let's not betray trust around them. Let's try to make sure that we stick to a very consistent communication path to our consumers of our APIs. Let's also make sure that the connections that we have with our APIs don't change dramatically. So nobody should have to dramatically rewrite code or change the way their applications are architected or integrated. So that communication pillar is really something that I would add to those 4 other elements. Making sure that you're communicating with your users is a really strong and valuable thing to do in your APIs. So let's talk quickly about API security strategy with the last couple of minutes that I have here before we get to Q&A. First thing, when we think about API security strategy, note what does and doesn't work for perimeter security. So things like firewalls, web application firewalls are usually not effective at scale for this. API gateways very much do bring this. I've recently analyzed this in another talk. Feel free to check that out on YouTube. Second, when we think about agents, what can agents provide us from an API security standpoint? The answer is really not a lot. So unless you're operating at the code level where API breaches happen based on things like application logic, that can be a real challenge. Next, when we think about monitoring, this is an area where we should be investing into tracking our APIs. APIs can live across a broad range of compute infrastructure. So make sure that when you think about how you're monitoring your APIs, you don't rely solely on the infrastructure layer monitoring that's provided, whether that is, let's say, system logs on a virtual machine or things like network logs on or network flow logs on a platform like AWS or Kubernetes or container logs. You want to monitor your APIs at the application layer so that you do understand what data has come in and gone out of your APIs, and that you've got kind of one single source of truth when you're investigating API breaches or any kind of questions around your APIs having been abused. So like I said, we've actually analyzed the kind of the last 10 years of API data breach events. Here's a link on this screen. Feel free to check that out. The kind of TLDR is a lot of the real problems with API security are around identity. So that's things like authentication and authorization protocols and around data handling. You can find more details in that. So, like I said, API security, it's definitely a key towards maintaining trust. I think we've talked about everything on the screen, so I'm going to kind of skip over this. But here's a QR code that you can scan, and there's the link that'll take you directly to the report. And for anybody who's interested, we certainly are offering free trials, and we actually just released a free tier of the FireTail API security platform. That QR code will take you directly to the platform where you can sign up for the free tier. And in addition to that, feel free to look at our API security code libraries, which are open source and available on GitHub. And I think with that, we should have a few minutes left for Q&A. Mariana, how are we
Yeah,
looking on Q&A time?
that's right. Yeah, we still have a few minutes, so
You're on mute.
I'm sorry. Rose, can you hear me now? No?
No. If you want to drop the comments into the chat, I'll kind of repeat the questions into the chat. I'll repeat them for the audience.
Okay. Maybe they are telling me that maybe you muted your window. If not, I will send you the first question to you on the chat, yeah?
Okay. Could you repeat the question, Mariana?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So of the 4 pillars of trust, which do you think is the most important and why?
Well, look, I'm a little bit biased. I come from the security perspective. And so obviously I think security is super important, but I actually think overall transparency. So if you can communicate the policies around your API clearly and keep that with your partners, I think that's actually the most important and most valuable thing that you can do.
Sure. And about examples, which actually were very illustrative. That was great. So you used a few security examples, but is security the only way to lose trust?
No, definitely not. I mean, think about that Reddit example, right? There was nothing related to security. Just the change in the policy around the API really turned off and alienated the entire community, and that was super unfortunate. There are other ways, by the way. So we think I mentioned versioning, and we didn't talk about it a lot. But if you change all of a sudden the version of your API or the functionality exposed by your API, not just the kind of paid versus free, but let's say I offered a feature that all of a sudden I take away, that can be a real problem for people who have come to rely on my APIs. So that's another big, let's say, no.
Yeah, right. Correct. So how does a company like FireTail help in an API ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we do, certainly for anybody who is kind of building and putting their own APIs out there to be consumed, first, we help you maintain visibility over all the APIs you have. One challenge that we see from a lot of organizations is that, 1 or 2 developers or application owners might have put some APIs out into the world or onto the web. But before you know it, there's more that are getting published. Once you start to see some success with some of your APIs and have some traction, we actually see organizations it's like a one-way path. You see a little bit of momentum, and it's just more and more developers come in and kind of push the organization forward. So first challenge is just knowing all the APIs that you're exposing out to the world, all the versions, all the different endpoints, methods available, functionality available. Maintaining that visibility is the first thing. The second thing is for developers, nobody wants to be the developer that publishes an insecure API. And a lot of developers will focus on kind of defining the API from, let's say, a specification perspective, but then making sure that that specification is observed in production and is actually turned into a set of security checks is the second thing that we do. So we have an open source code library available for 4 languages plus serverless environments today that can really help take that in and put that into an active security control.
Wow, great. Well, I think that, we don't have more time left. So really, thank you. This was really brilliant. And thank you. We hope you can join us in the future. And
Absolutely.
Thank you for sharing all your contact information. And we hope to see you soon.
All right. Sounds great, Mariana. Thanks so much.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Bye-bye.